I have to tell this story. Some things are too heavy to carry alone, and the world needs to know that monsters sometimes wear designer clothes and smile for the cameras. This all happened to me, exactly as I'm about to tell it. The conference room at Thompson, Crestwood, and Finch was suffocating, smelling of old leather, lemon polish, and greed. The mahogany table was a dark, gleaming mirror, reflecting the distorted faces of my stepmother, Serafina, and her son, Julian. They were gathered for the reading of my father's will, and I was the ghost at the feast. The moment the lawyer, a man with a ferret's face named Marcus Thorne, read the final clause, bequeathing to me, Alara Vance, a single, dusty box of my father's old philosophy books, Julian let out a sharp, ugly bark of laughter. Serafina merely smiled, a tight, triumphant little curl of her lips, and patted his hand as if he were a clever dog who'd just performed a trick. They thought they had won. They thought the story ended there, with my humiliation reflected in the polished wood of that table. They didn't know I was holding the real final chapter right there in my purse. If you genuinely enjoy our stories, please subscribe to the channel, tell us where you're from, and what time it is right now. It's always fascinating to know how far our story flows. My father, Richard Vance, was a titan. He built a real estate empire from the ground up, a monolith of steel and glass that reshaped the New York City skyline. To the world, he was a force of nature. To me, for the first 12 years of my life, he was just Dad. He was the man who taught me how to read blueprints on our living room floor, who smelled of coffee and sawdust, and whose laugh was a low rumble that could shake the windows of our Upper East Side brownstone. It was just the two of us after my mother passed, a small, tight unit against the world. He was my architect, my foundation, my entire world. And then Serafina arrived. She floated into our lives on a cloud of expensive perfume and calculated sympathy. A gallerist from somewhere in Europe, with a tragic backstory that changed with her audience. To my father, a lonely widower, she was a siren. To me, she was an invader. She was beautiful in the way a Venus flytrap is beautiful, all elegant lines and hidden teeth. Her son Julian, a year older than me, was her shadow, possessing all of his mother's cruelty but none of her cunning. He was a creature of simple, brutal arrogance. He cornered me in the library once, just weeks after they moved in, and tore the cover off my favorite book. "My mother says your time here is limited," he'd whispered, his breath sour. "This house, the money, it's ours now." He was a stupid boy, but even a fool can speak the truth when it's been fed to him by a master. Serafina's campaign was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It was death by 1,000 cuts. She started small, redecorating my mother's favorite rooms, replacing her photographs with abstract art that felt as cold and empty as her soul. She'd lose messages from my friends. She'd tell my father I was being moody and difficult, framing my grief as teenage rebellion. She intercepted my report cards, highlighting a single B+ amongst straight A's and sighing dramatically about my lack of focus. She was poisoning the well, drop by insidious drop. The father who had seen me as his brilliant legacy began to see me as a problem. The distance between us grew, not like a chasm, but like a rising tide of murky water, engineered by her. The summer I was 18, she orchestrated the final act. She claimed I'd stolen a pair of her diamond earrings I later saw her find in her own jewelry box with a gasp of relief. But the damage was done. My father, exhausted and worn down by her constant whispers, her manufactured drama, her endless campaign, finally broke. The argument was a hurricane in the sterile white living room she had designed. His voice, for the first time, was full of weary disappointment. "I can't do this anymore, Alara. Maybe sometime apart. A different environment would be best." He paid for my tuition at UCLA, a continent away. He sent money, always, but the calls became less frequent, his voice more distant. I knew, with the chilling certainty of a betrayed child, that Serafina was always there, listening on an extension, her presence a static on the line. I built a life for myself in Los Angeles, becoming an architectural historian, ironically studying the legacies of great men while my own was being dismantled. The last time I saw him alive was 2 years before his death. I'd flown home unannounced for his birthday. I found him frail, his sharp eyes clouded with a confusion that terrified me. Serafina was there, of course, hovering, speaking for him, finishing his sentences. She told me the trip was too much for him, her voice dripping with false concern. She walked me to the door of the home I grew up in, a polite but firm bouncer at my own life. "He needs his rest, dear," she'd said, her smile never reaching her eyes. "Let's not upset him." That was the last time I saw my father. He died of a reported heart condition 6 months ago. I wasn't even notified until 2 days after the funeral. Serafina had claimed it was a clerical error. So here I was, back in New York, in a room that reeked of smug victory, being handed a cardboard box as my inheritance. Julian snickered again as I took it. "Enjoy the reading, Ella," he sneered, deliberately using the diminutive I'd always hated. "Maybe you'll learn something." I stood, my legs feeling strangely steady. I looked at Serafina, her face a perfect mask of serene triumph. I looked at Julian, a preening fool already counting his money. I looked at Thorne, who wouldn't meet my eyes. I didn't say a word. I just nodded, turned, and walked out of that mahogany-scented hell, the box clutched in my hand. The weight of it felt like nothing compared to the cold, hard stone of resolve forming in my chest. They thought they had buried me. They had no idea I was a seed. As I stepped out into the biting wind on Park Avenue, the weight of the box in my arms felt less like an insult and more like a key. I took a taxi back to my hotel, the St. Regis, a place my father had taken me for tea as a child. In the sterile quiet of my room, I placed the box on the bed and pried open the cardboard flaps. The musty smell of old paper filled the air. Plato, Socrates, Camus, all the books he'd given me when I was a teenager, the ones that had sparked our best conversations. My fingers traced the worn spines, a wave of grief so sharp it almost brought me to my knees. It felt like a final, cruel joke. But my father wasn't cruel. He was a puzzle solver, a man who loved codes and blueprints. He never did anything without a reason. I picked up the heaviest volume, Plato's Republic. It felt off balance. I shook it gently. Nothing. I ran my fingers along the inside cover, over the thick, marbled paper. And there, under a loose flap of the bookplate, my nail caught on something. A tiny raised edge. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I carefully peeled the paper back, and my breath caught in my throat. It wasn't a note. It was a key. A small brass key for a safe deposit box, intricately stamped with the emblem of a private vault, one I knew wasn't his usual bank. And taped to it was a tiny folded piece of paper. On it, in his familiar spidery handwriting, were just 4 words. "The architect protects his work. The architect protects his work." It wasn't just a sentence. It was a message, a lifeline thrown across time and death. It was the motto of his first company, the one he built before the empire, the one he named after my mother. It was his code, and it meant he hadn't abandoned me. He had left me a blueprint. The key was for a vault at a discreet, high-security facility in the Diamond District, a place called Corinthian Storage. Getting access was its own kind of war. Serafina had canceled my family credentials, but my father, my brilliant, paranoid father, had set up the box under a trust bearing my mother's maiden name, a name Serafina wouldn't have even thought to check. It took 2 days of calls to the estate lawyer my father had used before Thorne, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Reed, to get the paperwork authenticated. The entire time I felt like I was being watched. Every black car that lingered at a light, every stranger who held my gaze for a second too long, felt like one of Serafina's spies. I knew she wouldn't just let me walk away. She would want to ensure I was truly broken. The vault was cold, silent, and smelled of steel and ozone. The attendant used 2 keys to open the heavy door, then left me in the sterile viewing room. The box was heavier than I expected, My hands trembled as I lifted the lid. Inside there was no will, no stack of bearer bonds. Instead, there were 3 items. The first was a burner phone, sleek and black. The second was a thick, leather-bound journal. The third was a single, velvet-wrapped object. I unwrapped it first. It was my father's old fountain pen, a vintage Mont Blanc he'd used to sign his first major deal. It was the pen he'd used to sketch building designs on napkins during our dinners at the Carlisle. I unscrewed the barrel, my heart pounding. Tucked inside was a tiny, tightly rolled scroll of microfilm. A format so archaic it was brilliant. Serafina's tech goons would be looking for hard drives and cloud accounts, not something out of a Cold War spy movie. I turned to the journal. The handwriting wasn't my father's. I recognized it as belonging to Maria, his executive assistant for over 30 years. She was a fiercely loyal woman who had been more of a mother to me than Serafina ever could be. Serafina had fired her a year ago, claiming she was redundant. The first entry was dated the day after she was fired. "He's not himself," Maria wrote. "She's keeping him isolated. The new nurse, the one she hired, keeps his curtains drawn. She tells him his memory is failing. She tells him his friends don't call anymore, but I know for a fact that Walter from the board has called a dozen times. She's building a cage around him, and he's too tired to see the bars." I spent the next 4 hours in that cold room, devouring Maria's words. It was a harrowing chronicle of my father's last year. Serafina systematically cutting him off from his old life, firing loyal staff, from his driver to his chef, and replacing them with her own people. Changing his doctors, questioning his decisions in front of investors, framing it as concern for his cognitive decline. Maria had documented it all: dates, times, names. She wrote about the new will, how Thorne, a lawyer with a shady reputation, was brought in. How my father had signed it after a week of being heavily medicated for anxiety he'd never had before. He was a prisoner in his own home, a king being slowly, methodically dethroned by a smiling usurper. The journal was a testament to his capture, but the final entry was a testament to his rebellion. "Richard called me today," Maria wrote, her script shaky with emotion. He sounded like his old self for a few minutes, lucid, angry. He said, "She thinks she's won, Maria, but the architect protects his work. Tell Alara, tell my girl the architect protects his work. He told me he'd hidden things. A trail for Alara. He said she was the only one smart enough to follow it and strong enough to finish it. He said he was sorry. He said to tell her he loved her more than the sky." I closed the journal, tears blurring the cold steel walls of the vault around me. The grief was a physical blow, but underneath it the stone of resolve was hardening into diamond. He hadn't given up. He had been fighting in his own quiet, brilliant way. He had left me a weapon. As if on cue, the burner phone vibrated on the table. The screen lit up with a single text from an unknown number. "The pen is mightier than the sword, but evidence is mightier than both. Did you find his last design?" The message was a spark in the tinderbox of my anger. This was it. This was the start of the war. My father had drawn the blueprint for Serafina's destruction, and I was going to build it, piece by meticulous piece. I walked out of that vault, not as a disinherited daughter, but as my father's chosen executor. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. The text was from a man named Arthur Kendrick, my father's former head of security. He was ex-Secret Service, a man who moved with a quiet watchfulness and spoke only when necessary. He was fiercely loyal to my father and had treated me with a gruff kindness since I was a child. Serafina had him fired 6 months before my father's death, replacing him with a team of thuggish private contractors who reported only to her. Arthur was my father's secret soldier, his operative on the outside. We met at a discreet corner table at the back of the Odeon in Tribeca, a place my father had loved for its timelessness. Arthur looked older, the lines around his eyes deeper, but his gaze was as sharp as ever. "He knew this was coming," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "He saw the web she was spinning. He was just trapped inside it. By the end, he was playing a long game. The microfilm was his Hail Mary. That night, I took the microfilm to a specialized archival service in the city that Arthur had recommended. The technician, a man with a jeweler's loop permanently attached to his glasses, carefully mounted the tiny scroll. What appeared on the screen made the blood in my veins run cold. It was a series of crystal-clear images of financial documents. Offshore bank accounts in the Cayman Islands under a shell corporation named S.J. Holdings. Transfers, millions of dollars, siphoned from my father's personal accounts and company ventures over the past 5 years. And the signatures authorizing these transfers, they were my father's, but they were wrong, shaky, distorted. Some looked like clumsy forgeries, others like the scrawl of a man whose hand was not his own. The last image was not a document. It was a photograph of a handwritten note from my father. Serafina and Julian. They think the money is the prize, but the prize is the legacy. They're trying to steal my name, Alara, my work. Don't let them. Use this. Burn them to the ground. While I was arming myself in the shadows, Serafina and Julian were dancing in the spotlight. They were the new king and prince of New York society. They hosted a lavish charity gala at the Guggenheim. The pictures splashed across Vogue and Town and Country. Serafina, draped in Dior, stood in front of a banner for the newly renamed Vance DeLuca Foundation, DeLuca being her supposed aristocratic family name. She gave a moving speech about carrying on Richard's philanthropic vision, a vision she had actively suffocated for years. Julian was named the new vice president of Vance Industries, and his first act was to announce a plan to demolish one of my father's first buildings, a historically significant landmark, to build a soulless glass condominium. They weren't just taking his money, they were erasing him, rewriting his history with themselves as the heroes. The public ate it up. They were the grieving widow and devoted stepson, bravely taking the reins. I was a ghost, a footnote, the estranged daughter who had been rightly cut off. The narrative she had spent years crafting was now her shield. Seeing my father's legacy being dismantled and worn like a costume by these vultures was the turning point. The grief solidified into a cold, diamond-hard fury. This was no longer just about an inheritance. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming my father's name. My first call was to Evelyn Reed, the lawyer my father had trusted before Thorne. I met her in her office near the South Street Seaport, a stark contrast to Thorne's mahogany mausoleum. Her space was modern, clean, and functional. Evelyn was in her 60s with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of absolute competence. She listened to my story without interruption, her fingers steepled under her chin. I laid it all out. The will reading, Maria's journal, the microfilm, Arthur's involvement. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she leaned forward, a glint in her eye I recognized from my father, the look of a predator spotting its prey. They didn't just exert undue influence, Ms. Vance, she said, her voice precise and cold. What you're describing is a conspiracy to commit fraud, elder abuse, and possibly much more. Thorne is a bottom feeder. Serafina must have promised him a lucrative position as the estate's permanent counsel. But they're arrogant. They're sloppy. And they have no idea what's about to hit them. That evening, I returned to my hotel room to find the burner phone vibrating again. It was Arthur. They're moving fast, he said, his voice tight. Julian is trying to liquidate assets from the Shell Corp. Serafina has a buyer lined up for the Southampton house. They're cashing out. But I have something for you. The nurse. The one Serafina hired. Her name is Brenda. She was fired 3 months ago after an argument with Serafina. She's scared, but she's angry. She's been working at a clinic in Queens. I think she's ready to talk. The final piece. The human element. The witness who could place Serafina's hand on the gilded cage she had built around my father. The battle was no longer a future prospect. Evelyn was filing the petitions, the first salvo in a war Serafina and Julian didn't even know had been declared. I looked out my hotel window at the glittering skyline my father had helped build. It looked like a battlefield waiting for its general. They had the money, the power, the public perception. But I had the truth. And the truth, my father always said, was the one structure that could never be demolished. The first shot was fired on a Tuesday morning. Evelyn Reed filed a petition in the New York County Surrogate's Court to formally contest my father's will. The grounds were clear and brutal: lack of testamentary capacity, undue influence, and fraud. We attached a sworn affidavit from Maria, detailing her observations of my father's isolation and Serafina's control. We didn't show our whole hand. The microfilm and the financial documents were our ace in the hole, to be played at the right moment. The reaction was immediate and dismissive. Marcus Thorne released a statement to the press on behalf of the grieving Vance family, calling the lawsuit a desperate and baseless cash grab by a disgruntled, estranged daughter. He painted me as a vulture, swooping in to pick at the bones of a man who wanted nothing to do with me. Serafina played the part of the wounded widow perfectly, photographed leaving her apartment in a black veil, dabbing a dry eye with a silk handkerchief. Julian was less subtle. He told a reporter from the New York Post, "She's pathetic. My stepfather knew her for what she was. He gave her exactly what she deserved. Nothing. The arrogance was staggering. They believed their own press. They couldn't imagine a world where they weren't in complete control. That arrogance was the first crack in their foundation. Our next step was to find Brenda, the nurse. Arthur had her address, a small walk-up in Astoria. I went with him. I wanted to see her face to face. Brenda was a woman in her late 50s, her face etched with exhaustion and fear. She almost slammed the door on us until Arthur mentioned my father's name. She let us in, her hands trembling as she made us instant coffee. She told us everything. She confirmed Maria's story and added horrifying details. Serafina controlled my father's medication schedule, often insisting on administering it herself. She would give him his anti-anxiety pills his primary doctor had prescribed for as-needed use, multiple times a day, especially before important meetings or when lawyers were visiting. He would get so groggy, Brenda whispered, wringing her hands. He'd be sharp as a tack 1 hour, and then after his meds, he'd be in a fog, agreeing to whatever she said. I questioned it once, and she looked at me with these dead eyes. She told me I was overstepping, that if I wanted to keep my job, I'd do as I was told. She fired me a week later with no severance, and had my nursing license threatened when I said I would report her. Evelyn had her give a formal deposition the very next day, a recorded testimony that was now a ticking bomb in our arsenal. The legal battle escalated. Thorne filed a motion to have our petition dismissed. We filed a counter-motion to freeze the estate's assets pending the outcome of the challenge. This hit them where it hurt. Suddenly, their infinite well of cash was potentially being cut off. The hearing was our first face-to-face confrontation since the will reading. The courtroom was small and stuffy. Serafina and Julian sat at the opposing table, flanked by Thorne and 2 other lawyers. When I walked in with Evelyn, Serafina's eyes widened for a fraction of a second. She hadn't expected me to look so composed. She expected a broken, weeping girl. She didn't expect a woman who looked ready for war. Thorne argued passionately, calling our evidence hearsay from disgruntled former employees. He was slick and condescending. Then Evelyn rose to speak. She was calm, methodical, and utterly devastating. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the facts one after another, building a wall of evidence. She concluded by presenting a single piece of new information. Your Honor, we also have a forensic handwriting analysis of the signature on a document that transferred controlling interest of Vance Industries to a trust managed by Ms. DeLuca and her son. The analysis concludes, with 99% certainty, that the signature of Richard Vance was forged. A collective gasp went through the small gallery. Thorne's face went pale. Julian started to rise from his seat, his face puce with rage, before Serafina put a restraining hand on his arm. Her mask of composure finally slipped. She stared at me, her eyes no longer filled with pity or condescension, but with pure, unadulterated hatred. The judge, a stern woman with a reputation for taking no nonsense, looked from the report to Serafina. She didn't grant our motion to freeze the entire estate, but she did issue a temporary restraining order, preventing the sale of any major assets, including the Southampton home and my father's landmark building, until the next hearing. It was a partial victory, but a significant one. We had stopped the bleeding. We had shown them we had teeth. As we left the courthouse, a swarm of reporters surrounded us. I said nothing, letting Evelyn handle it. But I looked over their heads and met Serafina's gaze. The war was no longer being fought in the shadows. It was in the open now. And she finally understood that I wasn't there to ask for scraps from the table. I was there to flip the whole damn table over. Serafina was a cornered animal, and cornered animals are the most dangerous. The restraining order had shocked her out of her complacency, and she and Julian came at me with everything they had. They hired a ruthless PI to dig up dirt on me, and when they couldn't find any, they manufactured it. Stories began appearing in gossip columns and online tabloids. Anonymous friends claimed I had a history of instability, that I'd been a party girl in college, that my entire lawsuit was an elaborate extortion plot. They leaked my college transcripts, trying to frame my degree in architectural history as proof of my obsession with my father's money. It was a classic smear campaign, designed to discredit me in the court of public opinion before I ever had my day in the real one. They tried to intimidate our witnesses. Maria found the tires on her car slashed. Brenda received a series of anonymous, threatening phone calls in the middle of the night. But my father had chosen his allies well. They were scared, but they were not broken. Arthur arranged for security for both of them, and their resolve only hardened. They had made a critical mistake. They thought I would fight like them, with lies and mudslinging. But I was my father's daughter. I would fight with facts and precision. I would fight with a blueprint. While Evelyn kept them tangled in a web of legal motions and discovery requests, I focused on the final piece of the puzzle my father had left me. The Mont Blanc pen. I knew the microfilm couldn't be all there was. It felt too impersonal for his final message. I spent hours with that pen, examining every millimeter of its polished resin and platinum plating. And then I found it. A tiny, almost invisible seam near the top. It wasn't part of the pen's normal construction. Using a fine-tip tool from an architectural model kit, I carefully worked at the seam. With a soft click, the top of the pen popped off, revealing a tiny cavity. Inside was a minuscule USB drive. Not microfilm. Modern tech hidden in plain sight. This was his true final design. I plugged the drive into a clean laptop Arthur provided. There was only one file on it. An audio file. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely click the mouse. I put on a pair of headphones and pressed play. The sound of my father's voice filled my ears, and I choked back a sob. It was weak, raspy, and laced with an exhaustion that felt bone deep. But it was him. "Recording," he said, his voice barely a whisper. October 12th. There was a rustle of fabric, then Serafina's voice, sharp and cloying. "Richard, darling, what are you doing with that old pen? Let me put it away for you." "Leave it," my father said, a spark of his old authority in his tone. "I want to talk to you, Serafina." "We can talk later, my love. It's time for your medication. You know how you get when you miss it. So confused." "I'm not confused," he shot back, his voice clearer now, fueled by adrenaline. "I know what you've been doing. The transfers. The shell company, SJ Holdings. Did you think I was that stupid? That I wouldn't notice $50 million missing from my portfolio?" There was a beat of silence. Then Serafina's tone changed. The syrupy sweetness vanished, replaced by a chilling flatness. "You're tired, Richard. Your mind plays tricks on you. The doctor said this would happen. I'm taking care of everything. I'm protecting your legacy." "You're stealing it," he rasped. "You and that worthless son of yours. You're vultures." The audio quality shifted, as if she was leaning closer. Her voice was a venomous whisper. And who is going to believe you? A sick old man? Or your loving, devoted wife who has stood by you? You pushed your daughter away. You have no one. I have given you everything. A beautiful home. A life of luxury. And this is how you repay me? With these paranoid fantasies? Now be a good boy and take your pill. Thorne is coming by this afternoon to finalize the foundation paperwork, and we need you to be agreeable. I heard the sound of a pill bottle rattling, then my father's labored breathing. The recording ended. I ripped the headphones off, my body trembling with a rage so pure it felt incandescent. It was all there. The confirmation of her theft, the admission of the drugging, the chilling display of her utter control over him. It was the smoking gun. It was the bomb that would not just win me the lawsuit but would utterly destroy her. Evelyn was ecstatic. "We could end this right now," she said, her voice buzzing with energy. "We play this for the judge in chambers and it's over. She'll be facing criminal charges." "No," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "Not yet. A courtroom is too private. A quiet settlement is too merciful. She wanted the spotlight. She craves the stage. So that's where we're going to end this. We're going to give her the audience she deserves." A week later, a thick cream-colored envelope arrived at my hotel. It was an invitation. Serafina, in a move of breathtaking arrogance, was hosting the annual Vance Industries Benefactors Gala at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was the pinnacle of the New York social calendar, an event my father had cherished. She was planning to use it to unveil the new plans for his demolished landmark building and formally install Julian as the public face of the company. The invitation was a final twist of the knife, a message that she had won so completely she could afford to dangle her victory in my face. I looked at the embossed V on the card and a slow, cold smile spread across my face. She had just handed me the perfect stage for her public execution. The night of the gala was a scene of calculated opulence. The Temple of Dender at the Met was bathed in soft, golden light, the ancient stone walls a silent witness to the modern pantomime of wealth and power. Waiters in tuxedos moved through the glittering crowd with trays of champagne and caviar. I saw them all there, the titans of finance, the politicians, the art dealers, the very heart of the New York City establishment my father had once commanded. And at the center of it all, holding court like a queen, was Serafina. She was wearing a blood-red gown that shimmered under the lights, a diamond necklace glittering at her throat. Julian stood beside her, preening in a custom tuxedo, his face flushed with champagne and unearned pride. They were untouchable. They were royalty. I had chosen my own armor carefully, a simple, elegant black dress, my mother's pearl earrings, my only jewelry. When I walked in, a hush fell over the group nearest the entrance. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the room like a breeze across water. I saw Serafina spot me. Her smile faltered for a heartbeat, her eyes narrowing into slits. Julian just sneered, dismissing me with a flick of his wrist. I ignored them all, taking a glass of water from a passing tray and finding a quiet spot near one of the massive pillars, making myself a part of the shadows. I watched. I waited. Evelyn and Arthur were also in place, blending into the crowd. Everything was set. Finally, the moment came. The lights dimmed, and a spotlight found Serafina on the small stage erected before the temple. She tapped the microphone, her smile radiant, projecting an image of grace and sorrow. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice smooth as velvet. "To celebrate the enduring legacy of my late husband, Richard Vance." Richard was a builder. He built buildings, he built a company, but most importantly, he built a dream. A dream that my son, Julian, and I are so deeply honored to carry forward. She went on, her words a river of beautifully constructed lies. She talked about their shared vision, their love, her devotion during his illness. As she spoke, Evelyn moved quietly to the back of the room, near the audiovisual controls. Arthur took a position near the stage, a silent, imposing guardian. "And so," Serafina said, reaching the crescendo of her speech. It is with great pride that I formally announce the new flagship project of the Vance DeLuca Foundation, the Julian Tower, a monument to the future which will stand where... She never got to finish the sentence, because at that moment, another voice filled the room. A voice that was weak, raspy, but clear as a bell, amplified through the state-of-the-art sound system. It was my father's voice. I'm not confused. I know what you've been doing. The transfers, the shell company, SJ Holdings. The entire hall fell silent. Every eye snapped to the stage, where Serafina stood frozen, her face a mask of horror. Julian looked around wildly, trying to find the source of the sound. The audio file continued to play, my father's desperate words echoing off the ancient stone. Then came Serafina's voice, her cold, venomous whisper filling the vast space. Who is going to believe you? A sick old man? Now be a good boy and take your pill! A collective gasp went through the crowd. The silence was replaced by a roar of shocked murmurs. The facade didn't just crack. It exploded, showering the glittering assembly with the ugly truth. As the recording ended, the house lights came up. And at the entrance to the hall stood 2 uniformed NYPD officers and 2 plainclothes detectives, one of whom was holding up a badge. Evelyn Reed stood beside them, her face impassive. Serafina DeLuca, one of the detectives called out, his voice cutting through the din. You and Julian DeLuca are under arrest for fraud, grand larceny, and on suspicion of felony elder abuse. All the color drained from Serafina's face. The queen was naked. Julian, his face purple with rage, finally broke. He lunged off the stage, screaming my name, his eyes wild. You bitch! I'll kill you! He never got close. Arthur intercepted him with the smooth, economical grace of a man who knew exactly how to handle entitled bullies, spinning him around and pinning his arms behind his back as one of the officers slapped handcuffs on his wrists. Serafina didn't move. She just stood there, the blood red of her dress a stark contrast to her ashen face. The reporters in the room, smelling the biggest society scandal in a decade, surged forward, their cameras flashing like lightning. As the officers escorted her off the stage, her eyes found mine across the chaotic room. Her mask of civility was gone, replaced by a look of such pure, primal hatred it was almost stunning. She said nothing. She didn't have to. But I held her gaze, unflinching, as they led her past the temple of a dead king, her reign of lies over at last. The aftermath was a whirlwind. The story was a media firestorm, a salacious tale of greed and betrayal that played out on the front pages of every paper in the city. The audio recording was undeniable. Brenda's testimony was damning. The financial evidence was irrefutable. Thorne was disbarred for his role in the conspiracy, his career ending not with a bang, but with the quiet shame of a settlement with the Bar Association. Serafina and Julian's trial was swift. Faced with the mountain of evidence, they took a plea deal. Serafina was sentenced to 10 to 15 years at the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. Julian, thanks to a slightly better lawyer, got 7 to 10. The Vance DeLuca Foundation was dissolved. The will was officially invalidated by the surrogate's court, and my father's previous will, the one he'd written after my mother died, was reinstated. In it, he left everything to me. The company, the properties, the foundation, the sprawling Fifth Avenue penthouse I hadn't set foot in for over a decade. All of it. My first act as the new head of Vance Industries was to hold a press conference. I announced we were immediately scrapping the plans for the Julian Tower and would instead be working with the city's Landmark Preservation Commission to fully restore my father's historic building. My second act was to reinstate his original foundation, the Vance Endowment, and triple its funding for architectural scholarships and historic preservation grants. I rehired Maria, Arthur, and every other loyal employee Serafina had cast aside. We spent months cleaning house, untangling the financial knots she had tied, and slowly, carefully, setting my father's legacy back on its proper course. One evening, weeks after the sentencing, Evelyn called me to her office. She had the last of my father's personal effects from the court. Tucked inside a folder with the original will was a sealed envelope with my name on it. He left instructions that you were only to be given this after everything was settled, she said gently. I took it back to the penthouse. The apartment was silent, the ghosts of my childhood lingering in the twilight, filtering through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. I sat in my father's leather armchair, the one that still faintly smelled of his cologne, and opened the letter. His handwriting was firm, from a time before Serafina's drugs had clouded his mind and stolen his strength. My dearest Alara, if you are reading this, it means you have done what I could not. You have won. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me. Not for leaving you this fight, but for allowing the fight to become necessary in the first place. I was a fool. A lonely old fool who let a viper into his house because he was afraid of the silence. She was a poison, and by the time I realized how deeply it had seeped into my life, I was already paralyzed. I knew I could not beat her from within the cage she built. But I knew I had created something far stronger than she could ever be. You. You have my mind, but you have your mother's fire. I knew you would not let this stand. I knew you would follow the breadcrumbs. This fortune, this company, they are just things, Alara. Tools. The only thing that has ever truly mattered is you. You were my greatest design, my most enduring structure. Don't let this fight define you. Let it be the foundation upon which you build a better world. I am so proud of you. I have always been so proud of you, all my love, Dad. The letter fell from my fingers onto the thick Persian rug. The tears I had held back for months finally came, a silent, scalding torrent in the empty apartment. I had won. I had reclaimed his name, his money, his legacy. I had vanquished the monsters and stood victorious atop the empire he had built. I had everything. But sitting there in the cavernous silence of his home, surrounded by all his triumphs, I realized the one thing my father's blueprint hadn't accounted for, the one thing my revenge could never give back. He had left me his entire world, but all I could hear was the silence where his voice should have been. The end.